Hello and welcome to our January 2017 newsletter. My name's Barry Beckham. I've been creating video tutorials for Photoshop, Elements, Lightroom, Pictures to Exe for quite a number of years now. Whenever I sit down to record a video for the newsletter, I try to include something new, innovative, or just something a little different. But of course, the longer you do this sort of thing, the more difficult that becomes. Audiovisual is usually a subject that can come to my help here because there's always some great topics that we can use for a newsletter video. I'd like to avoid that if possible here because I feel that a little bit later in the year we're going to see a brand new version of Pictures to Exe, Pictures to Exe 9. So when that's released, we'll be looking at that in some detail. Here I've decided to go back to a little bit of Photoshop work and also some infrared images. Now, why infrared images? Because it's quite a niche market, but of course the techniques we're going to use here with these infrared images are really no different to what we would use for our standard manipulation. These images were taken with a converted Canon 5D camera. What do I mean by converted? Well, all cameras have an infrared filter over the sensor in the body of the camera. So what we need to do to turn a camera into one which will shoot exclusively infrared images is to remove that infrared filter and in its place put a visible light filter which is generally deep red or magenta, hence the slight magenta cast you can see over these thumbnails. Now, you've probably already noticed that many of these images are bracketed exposures. In fact, there's 18 thumbnails, but there's actually only 6 different images because even in lighting conditions that are not all that tricky, quite often I will set up an automatic bracketing of the exposure. If I take you to the first image at the top left and we look at the metadata here, although I'm shooting in manual mode, I can still set the auto exposure bracketing to give me a one-stop difference between each of these pictures. So they was all shot using 200 ISO. They was all shot using f8. What will change is the shutter speed. So this image, for example, was a 60th of a second, this one a 125th of a second, and this one a 30th of a second. These were all handheld, so you may think 30th of a second, getting a little bit on the slow side. Yes, I agree, but we are using a wide angle lens. It's a zoom, and at this length it was, or when I shot this picture, it was 21mm. So with a little bit of care, a 30th of a second should be fine to handhold at that focal length. So whether I'm shooting infrared or visible light photographs, quite often I will turn to bracketing my exposures. Let me go through a scenario with you and see if you think you have experienced this. We frame up on a shot and we take the picture. We look at the LCD on the back of the camera and we notice that the picture is actually quite a lot overexposed. We need to compensate for the exposure. So we make that adjustment. We bring the camera back to our eye, we pre-focus, we pre-frame, we take the shot. When we look back, we find we haven't really compensated quite enough. We need just a little more. So we make another adjustment, but while we're doing all of this, the sun just slips behind the clouds, so when we lift the camera back to our eye and take the shot, now the image is too dark and we've either got to go back the other way or we've got to wait for the sun to reappear. So I find it very convenient to be able to frame up on the shot with the auto exposure bracketing set and the continuous setting on my camera. So when I squeeze the button, I get bump, 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 I get the 3 images. So what we're seeing here is 18 thumbnails, but in actual fact only 6 different images, and sometimes even those are varied exposures in one way or another. So why do I use auto exposure bracketing quite so much? Is it because I'm lacking a little confidence in my ability to capture the exposure I need? Well, not really, although we can all make mistakes, and I surely have, and I'm sure you have too. What I like mostly is the speed. I can dodge around a scene, choose the viewpoint, fire off 3 shots, move on to somewhere else. I'm not constantly digging in my bag if it was necessary to get out graduated filters and apply those. It costs nothing to shoot as many pictures as you wish, and I always come home with at least one optimum exposure, something that's just about right to start a manipulation to a completed image. In addition, and if I want to, I can use the 3 bracketed images to create a HDR image, although I'm not a great fan of HDR, I have to say. And if I'm shooting visible light photography and the lighting is a bit contrasty, then with 3 bracketed exposures I can possibly use one exposure for the top half of the image and another exposure for the bottom half, even if I've handheld the images, because I can align them in Photoshop as well. So there's an enormous amount of advantage to bracketing the exposures. Now, with infrared photography and with many of our visible light images too, we've got the opportunity within Bridge and Photoshop's Camera Raw to set up a preset. Now, I do this particularly with the infrared, but with other images as well. For example, if I open up one of these, on every infrared image that I shoot, I need to reduce the saturation. They almost always need a healthy slug of clarity to push in some contrast. Maybe the blacks need to be dropped down and the whites need to be lifted. Even a little bit of exposure sometimes. So I treat this as a sort of a jumping off point or a way of looking at the thumbnails. Let me show you what I mean by going here to my presets. I can select them, go down the bottom and click the little icon, and I can give the changes that I've made, and I can even select those as well, but for our purposes we'll just select them all, and I'll just call this infrared and OK. I'll also cancel the changes I've just made there and take you back to Bridge, because when I come back from shooting a batch of images, I can select the first one, hold the shift key and select the last, doesn't matter how many there are, right click, choose develop settings, and there's my preset. Once I select it, all of my images are changed to black and white and just given those initial changes that I like, and it just gives me a nice way of viewing the thumbnails. Now, the image I'm going to work on is one of these top 3. I like the one with the tree on the left. These ones look quite nice, but they've got a guy coming across here in a little canoe. So I think this one, and this one are the potential images to work on. And to be honest, I don't think it matters which one of those I select, because infrared is actually quite low contrast. I could select any one of them. I'm going to go for this one, which is the slightly lighter one, working on the assumption that I can always darken down shadows as much as I want, but it's not always so easy to lift shadows. Not that we've got really bad shadows in the other two, but for the sake of this manipulation, I'll double click this one and we'll open this up into Camera Raw. Now, although I've got some changes made via the preset that I applied in Bridge, it's not cast in stone, of course. I can go back to this little option here and I can say reset the Camera Raw default. So if I really wanted to then start from absolute scratch here, I can do so. But as well as applying the preset from Bridge, I can also apply it from here too. So in effect, I'm using my preset as a jumping off point. Now I've used a wide angle lens here, and if you look at the straight edge in the distance there, it does look as if it's curving up a little bit left and right. So the first place I'm going to go to is lens corrections. We don't really have to worry too much about chromatic aberration here because we're working in black and white, but when I tick the box you can see that it does straighten that up, but it probably needs a little more work than that. But what I think I'll do, I'll wait until I get the image further along the process in Photoshop, because I can always fix it there and there's no great disadvantage in doing so. So let's go back to our basic tab. So what I'm looking for here is as good a contrast as I can create. Now we can do that with the contrast, with the clarity, by spreading the highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, keeping an eye on the histogram. We also have a dehaze control, and that can be quite useful as well. But what I'm going to do here is start to just follow my nose really. I'm going to drop the blacks down a little more. Maybe I'll increase the contrast, but now that does drop the blacks a little more, so maybe I'll back off on that. I'm looking at the whites, so I'm just going to move the highlights a little bit to the right, but not too much. The whites are okay. I'm looking at the histogram here. I do think the blacks could go a little bit to the left. But what I'm not too happy about here is the sky itself. I want a lot more power in that sky. So I think what I'm going to do here, I'm going to concentrate more on the sky here and ignore the rest of the image just for the moment. I'm going to take the blacks off. I'll leave the whites. The contrast I'm happy with, although I'll try removing it, but no, that takes away more than I'm willing to give. So at the moment I'm looking at the sky in my picture and I'm trying to settle on what I want there, and I'm ignoring what's going on down here. I'm going to use two separate versions of this image. I know what I do is different to how many people work, and you can do all what I'm going to do with layers and layer masks using the graduated filter and the adjustment brushes in either Camera Raw and Lightroom 2. It's just a preference in the way I work. I just find it a bit easier to control. So what I'm going to do here is open up a smart object. A smart object is a setting you can apply in Camera Raw, and it just allows me, let me reset my background here to dark grey. It just allows me to open up this image as many times as I want back into Camera Raw and make changes without losing any quality at all. And the first thing I want to do is to go to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose to make a new smart object via a copy. Because what I'd like to do now is to open up one of these layers again into Camera Raw, and now I'm going to adjust this ignoring the sky. So I want to pay attention to the foreground and the tree most of all. So I'm going to lift the exposure. I'll double click to reset the exposure because I did like the tree right at the start. I would like to see if I can get a little more contrast in the tree, so maybe I can push up the whites. You see, I can ignore what's happening with the background to a large degree. I think that looks okay. I'm getting quite a lot of contrast and interest in the tree and also in the foreground, albeit there's a few distractions here, but we can deal with those too. Now, how far do I go? Well, we're never entirely sure, but at the moment I'm going to say OK, which is going to update that second layer in Photoshop. So what we've got here is the best of both worlds. There we've got the tree in the foreground. Here we've got mainly the sky. Not too concerned about the top right. I'm happy for that tree to be quite dark. It holds the corner nicely. So what I need to do is to maybe put a layer mask on that top layer so that I can mask this one to allow the lighter tree and the foreground to come through. Now this is easier than it sounds, to be honest. We don't have to be precise with our work, but we have to be careful. And I'd like to ask you to make some allowance because I will be working quite quickly because I'm conscious that the video could get a little too long. But having said all that, it's not going to take more than 3 or 4 minutes to mask through the areas we want, and that's not a long time. So I need black as my foreground colour. I need a basic brush. If you don't have a basic brush, go to the options at the top of the screen and locate them down here and say OK, and they will replace any brushes that were already there. I need a soft brush. I can make the brush bigger using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, of course. The opacity, I'm going to work with it at 100%, but the flow, I'm going to click this icon so I can adjust the flow with the number keys on the keyboard. But 10% isn't a bad place to start, so I'm just going to start masking in the foreground here, and you can see I start to lift the foreground and the tones in the foreground, and I can choose how far I decide to go. Now I've got my image fully on screen here, but from time to time we're going to have to zoom in and drop the brush size down to do areas a little bit more specifically. But you can see it doesn't take too long. I'm going to let you stay with me for a little while and then I'll stop and finish off, but I want to make it fairly clear. I'm going to push my flow rate up a little more. Be careful doing this because it can run away with you if you're not careful, but I want you to stay with me long enough to make sure that you believe me when I say this isn't a lengthy process. And of course we're working on a mask, aren't we? So even if we get things dreadfully wrong, there's no problem. We just switch from spraying black to white and we can repair any little errors we make. So really it's a foolproof way of working. So just take this a little bit gently, but as you can see you don't have to go right near the edge of each of the branches. Let's move up the left hand side and you'll see what I mean. See, we've got a shadow there. We can let that shadow work for us. We can raise the tones elsewhere, drag the picture down and do the bits that we want to do. When we start to get really near the edge, then let them go dark because that's working in your favour. And while we're up here, I could start here and start working back down. Now I'm going to stop my recording at this point and I'm going to carry on and finish off, but really I'm probably only going to put in more or less exactly the time we've already done here. Now I finished the masking on the tree and I added a little bit in the boat and a little bit on those few twigs down the bottom right. But I've saved this as a Photoshop file because I'm quite happy now to merge these layers together. So I'm going to go down to Merge Visible. I've got a few little jobs to do. There's a little bit of gardening to do, so I'm going to pick up my spot healing brush here. There's a mark in the sky that I've got to deal with. That's a dust mark. But down here I've got some little bits and pieces that I need to put right. These are the sorts of things which I generally touch out in my pictures. Now, if you ever do this yourself and you do this on a new blank layer, at the end of the exercise you can turn that new blank layer on and off, so you can effectively see a before and after. It's only when you do that, I think, that you really start to appreciate how very small highlights, but a lot of them, can start to impact on your picture. And they're so easy to put right these days with the spot healing brush. Photoshop has given us a superb tool here, and as you can see we can do quite a bit with it in a very short space of time. How far do you go? Well, the bigger you make the picture, the more little marks you see. So one of the tips I've got is to do what you can see, as I am here, but then at some stage hit Ctrl+0 to fit the image on the screen. Then if you see anything that draws your attention, then zoom in and deal with those. Just a few touches and they'll be gone. Zoom out again, Ctrl+0, move along and deal with all of the little items that you feel are a bit distracting. anything that's white or bright right near the edge, see if you can deal with that, because that's going to be a distraction. But let's take a look at that just for a couple of minutes. And that looks much nicer, although I still think I could do with just one or two more here, just to finish that up. You can get quite stuck into this sort of thing and almost never know when to finish. But let's say we're happy with that. Now I can see my image in its entirety. I want to take a look at that background there, that horizon line. I'm going to bring up my rulers. You'll find these in the view menu, but Control R is a nice quick shortcut. From within the rulers I can drag out a guide. So if I put a guide just below that horizon, you can see it's quite close there, but it's drifting off up here. So I can fix that by putting the free transform tool on here. Again, that's in the edit menu. Control T is the shortcut for the command. But then at the top of the screen I want to use this option to warp it, because I can go over here and I can drag that curve down. I may need to move along and do a little bit there. Take a bit of care on this, but whatever you do is going to be a lot better than it was. Let's take a look at that by hitting the tick on the options bar. Once that's done, I'll hit Control R again to lose the rulers. Then I'll go to View and Clear Guides, and we've certainly got that a lot more acceptable. I'm going to try a little bit of dodging on the tree. So I'm going to pick up my dodge tool. I'm going to select highlights. I'm going to see if I can just, looking up at the exposure, I've got 10%. I just want to see if I can just lift these a little bit. Looks like they may be more mid-tones, but let me zoom into the base of the tree. Make my brush an appropriate size. I just wanted to see if I could tease up the tones a little bit here. Can you see them lifting? I'm doing it very gently. We possibly could do with a bit of mid-tone as well, perhaps. Let's do a little bit of mid-tone first, because these are quite interesting. Just lifting it once we can see the entire thing. And again, I'm working very quick and dirty here, and you will take a bit more care. But down here you can see I've raised these areas a little bit, just to give a bit of interest. And I'm just going to work along the rest of the tree, just in those areas, and perhaps switching to the highlights, just to make as much from that contrast as I can without burning anything out, of course. And when I'm happy with that, sit back and we can take a look. Now the first thing I notice is these highlights here may be a little bit too high, so let's switch from the dodge tool to the burn tool. Let's stay with highlights. The exposure is 8%, just a couple of sweeps of my brush along here, and that's okay. I've got some darker tones in the sky here. We could investigate the burn tool there, but maybe with shadows or midtones, and just give a little bit more contrast in between the sky where the dark areas are. Some of this is right and wrong, but a lot of it, of course, is personal choice. Now, one of the other things I often do is to give a little bit of a vignette around the outer edge, but I think this is one of the rare times when the image probably doesn't require it. It's pretty solid down there and around and along the top, and even down the left-hand side. But another dodge that I quite like to use is, let's go to the layers first. We've got an unlocked layer, image, image size. I'm going to give this a little more width. So looking at the width in inches there, I'm going to unlink the width and the height by clicking the chain link. I'm going to make my width 21 inches but leave the height at 12.5. Click OK and you'll see the effect of what I've just done. Seems to be one or two areas where I could do with a little bit more burning. So select the burn tool, select highlights. There's just a little bit there that attracted my attention, and down the edge of the tree. Was that something I did working a little bit too fast? I'm not sure, but we can deal with it anyway. Now, having saved my image again, I've made a copy, so I've got two identical copies here, because I want to take the top one into my filters and take a look at the Nik Collection Silver FX Pro 2. If you've not already searched for these, if you search via Google, these are a free set of filters that are well worth having. I want to go to one or two in particular which I found suit my needs quite often. Down here we're looking at, where's the one I'm looking for? There we are, high structure and high structure smooth. Now you can see the instant effect it has on the image, but I can see a before and after by just clicking the compare. So if I click the compare, there's my version, there's the filtered version. My version, filtered. Go back to the high structure, my version, the filtered version. Now I don't know about you, but I like that. I like what it's doing. It's just giving me that little bit extra contrast. And I'm going to say, yes, I'll have that. Thank you very much. Once the filter effect has run, I can go to my layers and I can compare a before and after, just to make sure I'm happy with what the filter has done. You'd also notice that it automatically created itself a new layer. I didn't actually need to have made a copy earlier on. Some filter systems do this, some don't, and for the moment I just forgot that Silver FX Pro does or has a setting. So I would save this as a layered file so that tomorrow I could come in here and say, no, I made a mistake and I want this one back. But for the sake of what we're doing here, I'm going to say I'm happy with that, and we're going to flatten that to more or less finish the image. But of course, once we've finished the image and we've saved a black and white version, you can see it saving down on the bottom left there, what I could consider is now any special effects, because we can create as many copies as we wish. So for example, I could even now go to Filter and go back to Camera Raw, using the Camera Raw now as a filter, because what I'm looking for up here is the split toning. Let me just bring the saturation up a little bit on both of these, so we could have a look and see what sort of effect we can create with the split toning by choosing different colors here, a mixture of a sort of a yellowy color and the blue. And we've got infinite changes with the saturation here. Well, you get the idea. There's so many changes here that we could be here all day and create 50 different variants. But at some stage we would have to say, yes, give me that. But of course we can save this alongside our original black and white, because if you're ever unsure if the manipulation you've done is the correct one, and you may have 2 or 3 variants, just keep them together for a couple of weeks, and every now and again open them up and just have a look at them. Pretty soon the strongest of the images you've created will naturally float to the surface. Just to bring this video to a close, here's a technique I often apply to images that I'm going to place in Camera Club competitions. Generally I wait until I've resized the image accordingly. My particular Camera Club, the upper limit is the HD size 1920x1080. So if I pick up my crop tool here and I've got the values there automatically, if I click, I can see that they're going to work pretty well for me here. If I just drag them up a little bit, I can get the bottom part of the image nicely in. What I'm losing at the top is not an issue at all, and of course we've almost tidied up the composition a little bit. So let's assume that's what we're going to place in the Camera Club competition. Sometimes when we've got trees which contain lots of leaves and there's lots of bits around, we can often simplify the image still further. Of course black and white is a simplifying effect, but one of the others is a filter. Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Simplify. They have a buzz simulation filter. Let me look at the picture at 100% so we can see the leaves and the twigs here. It's the buzz sim that I want, but I don't want anything like we can see here. So over on the global adjustments here, I want to drop the size down to about 0.06 or 7. Now, last time I did this, it took quite a while for it to actually sharpen up on screen here. Now, it did take quite a few seconds for that image to sharpen up and show me a visual representation of what I wanted, but I was quite confident with the setting because I've used it before. So when we go out shooting images, bracketing the exposures is not always done because there's a lack of confidence in the photographer's ability to capture the right exposure. So my bracketing of exposure actually gives me the confidence that when I get home, whether it's a week or a month later, when I first look at the thumbnails I've shot, there's going to be one or two where I'm not quite so enamored with the content now. But for those that I do like this one here, I do know that the files that I've captured are going to give me the best advantage to work this through Camera Raw or Lightroom to get the best quality from the file. And remember, when we're shooting images in the modern age, it's not always about trying to capture that perfectly good looking shot we see on the back of the camera or in a thumbnail. It's what's within that file which is going to give you the best quality. And then of course, once I've captured and manipulated the image that I first intended, then I'll move on and I'll try some derivatives. Sometimes I'll just create one. Sometimes I can create 3 or 4. And as I said a little bit earlier, just keep all those files together, even if you only look at them as thumbnails inside of Bridge. Within a short time, the best of them will make itself known to you. The techniques that I've demonstrated here, and many more, are included in my Photoshop for Photographers, a complete Photoshop course. I've created this in 7 sections. The first section is completely free. Just come to our website, go to the Photoshop tutorials, Photoshop Creative Cloud, there it is right at the top. If I just scroll down here, you can see there is a video for each part, but here you can see all 7 parts. The first part is free. Just click on the option here, and when it opens up, click the free red MP4 button and download the first section. For those who haven't seen my videos in the past, perhaps you're viewing this particular video on YouTube, then download part 1 of the Photoshop for Photographers, because it will give you a good evaluation into the size, quality and style of delivery for my Photoshop for Photographers set, because it has to meet your needs. But I'm pretty confident once you download and try part 1, you'll see that it probably will. So why not come to www.beckhamdigital.com.au, take a look at our image galleries down here on Flickr, because unless you're impressed with the images we produce, you're unlikely to be impressed with our tutorials. But then go to Photoshop Tutorials, select Creative Cloud Tutorials and the Photoshop course, and you can download part 1 completely free. Just scroll down to part 1, there it is, and the button is on the main page alongside a YouTube video which explains the content of what you're about to download. Now, as well as part 1 being free for you to download, if you go back to the Photoshop tutorial list at the top center of the page, choose CC Tutorials and Photoshop Categories, If you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you'll see I do have a number of different headings, such as a dedicated set on selections, raw, layers, and many others too. But I brought you here to point out that there's also a set of Photoshop tutorials for Bridge, again free to download and evaluate.